Hello and welcome to The Wild Side. That was Chris Isaac with Baby Did a Bad Bad Thing. And I am your host, Dr. Caitlin Kight. And before I kick off today's show, I want to just give a little bit of a shout out to a fundraising concert that is being run by some of the students from the University of Exeter. And these guys are interested in raising some money for a local business that has been really helpful to the university in general, and particularly to the biology department. And that's AK Wildlife Cruises. And they are kind of a very ecologically savvy company, and they do a lot of looking out for wildlife and then reporting unusual sightings to our students and offering them opportunities to do internships, and also being really useful in terms of field trips and things like that. And so these students would like to support them and kind of keep that relationship going. And to do that, they are raising money for the company at the Gilly Beach Cafe, and everyone I think knows where that is, but over on Cliff Road here in Falmouth. And that will be on Tuesday the 22nd of October at 7:30 p.m. And it's going to involve kind of some open mic night things, if I understand correctly, so it should be fun, and maybe you can also participate as well as go along and kind of help out and donate some funding. Now, on to the meat of the show. Today I am going to talk about a topic which I haven't done for a while. I've been doing a lot of kind of reviewing the latest science, and I will do a bit more of that in the future, but I wanted to take a bit of a break and go back to my original kind of standard type of show, which was to do a bit of research on a particular topic in science and share that information with you. And this is actually one that I think might turn into a two-part series or maybe even a three-part series, and it is about pregnancy, and in particular pregnancy in humans. And this is something that I'm interested in because so many of my friends lately are having their first children, some of them are having their second children, and so they're going through pregnancy, and I know so little about it. And I'm an only child. I don't have close friends or cousins or whatever that have had children that I've been around, so I really have no idea what pregnancy is like. I have no idea what childbirth is like and all those sorts of things. Basically, all I know is what I've seen in movies or on television, and of course, that's not always the most scientific information. So recently I did a bit of reading up on pregnancy in order to understand kind of the science behind, how does pregnancy happen, what happens during pregnancy, and then kind of, what happens as the baby comes out and is in those very first couple of days when it's transitioning from living inside the mother to living in this brand new outside world. And it's a really fascinating process, actually, and it's just amazing kind of what the human body is capable of, and what processes are involved in having a little single cell from each parent turn into this really complex organism. And so today I want to talk a little bit about pregnancy from the baby's perspective. So how is the baby created? How does it change over time? And what eventually happens through the course of pregnancy to get that baby out into the world? And then maybe next week I'll think about pregnancy from the mother's perspective, so sort of the changes that happen within a mother's body. And also maybe I'll think about what happens when pregnancy doesn't happen. So what happens when people need to ask about IVF tactics and other sorts of alternative methods of getting pregnant and having a child, because that also is very interesting, and it has been one of the amazing achievements of modern medicine, I think. So to start off with, a really basic question is, what is pregnancy? Well, pregnancy is a colloquial term that we use for the scientific term being gravid, or carrying offspring while they're gestating within the mother. And pregnancy begins with implantation, which is when an embryo adheres to the wall of the uterus. But of course, there are lots of steps that happen before pregnancy that have a huge impact on pregnancy, so I don't want to just start there. I want to review those other things that happen to really make pregnancy possible. So of course we know that all of this is coming about because there has been sex. And so you've got a male and a female bringing together their gametes. And this is a spermatozoon from the male, and then an oocyte from the female. Now, of course, some of you who are a little bit more well-read in some of these things know that there are now alternatives available, so it doesn't always have to be the same kind of sex that we knew from before and the same kind of gametes that we knew from before, but this is traditionally how it was done in humans. So you've got these two gametes that are coming together, and each of them is a haploid, which means that it has a single set of chromosomes. And when the two things come together in a process that's known as fertilization or conception, they come together to create a zygote, and a zygote is diploid, and that means that it ends up with that pairing of chromosomes that all of us now have as adults. So fertilization itself is also something that is not just a single step. It also is a bit more complicated, just like pregnancy is. So really, it all starts when you've got these sperm that enter the female, and fresh sperm that have just come from the male are not really very good at fertilizing an egg, and in fact they may actually be incapable of fertilizing an egg. And they're only able to do this after they undergo a process that's known as capacitation, and this process occurs within the female body. And this is aided by the fact that the uterus secretes a number of products, including things like albumin, lipoproteins, and enzymes, and all of these help the sperm kind of mature, if you like. And they do this by removing the steroids and the proteins that are found in the membrane of the sperm. And they destabilize the membrane and therefore help the sperm to kind of bind and fuse with the female's egg. So by making that membrane less secure, basically, they help it kind of open up and spill its contents into the egg. Now the sperm will also increase in motility over this time while it's in the uterus before it gets to the egg. And it will just gradually start to see some improvements in the ability of its flagellum to move around and get it kind of active and moving around through the uterus and in towards the egg within the female. And this increasing pattern of activity is called hyperactive motility pattern. And the sperm's flagellum is vigorously whipping around, sending it through the uterus and eventually into the fallopian tube. And where it wants to go in the fallopian tube is a very specific place. It's not just kind of randomly having a bit of a tour. It's going to the site of fertilization, which is the ampulla. And this is in the second portion of the tube that kind of curves away from the uterus and over top of the ovary. And that is where the egg will be waiting for it. Now, of course, you know that the egg isn't sitting there all the time. The egg is released from the ovaries and it will make its way up there and then sit there for a little bit before eventually exiting again. And so this all has to happen with perfect timing, that the sperm get there just in time to find the egg and make fertilization happen. So the fusion of the two gametes is initiated by binding of glycoproteins that are found on the surface of each of these different gametes. So they find each other and they interact with each other and they allow the two things to then become one. And for the egg, these glycoproteins are found in something called the zona pellucida, and that's a membrane that surrounds the plasma membrane of the oocyte. So the egg itself has multiple different membranes, and it's this one that has the glycoproteins that allows the two things to fuse. And after these two types of glycoproteins have started to react with each other, there's something called the acrosome reaction. And during the acrosome reaction, the outer membrane of the sperm head is fusing with the plasma membrane of the egg, and that exposes the contents of the acrosome, the sperm head. And some of these contents include things like antigens and enzymes, and these can break through the tough coating of the outside of the egg and therefore allow fertilization to happen. And all of this, of course, is quite a difficult process for a very good reason, because you don't want any kind of accidental thing to happen. You don't want a sperm that's kind of lesser quality. You really want to test the product that you're buying in a way. And so the female reproductive system has, put up all of these barriers to make sure that only the healthiest types of sperm from the best types of male with the best types of genes that have all of the strongest and most successful types of characteristics in their sperm are going to be able to jump all these barriers and get to the egg. So once the egg is activated by all of this process, the two nuclei, the ones from the sperm and the one from the egg, can fuse and then create the zygote. And to prevent multiple fertilizations, the egg membranes will then undergo some changes so that the egg is impenetrable to additional sperm. And this generally happens basically the moment that the sperm and the egg begin to fuse, to make sure that you don't have others that are coming along and fusing at the same time, because generally that's not a very good thing. Now obviously we do have things like twins and triplets and even more that can happen naturally, but just naturally speaking, humans do much better when we do only have the one young, and so the body has evolved over time to make sure that this is the most common thing that happens. Welcome back to the Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was James Taylor with Sweet Baby James. and today I am talking about pregnancy. And just before the break I was discussing the process of fertilization and implantation of the blastocyst in the uterus. And now I want to think about the first trimester of pregnancy. And you probably already know that the first trimester is the first 12 weeks of the pregnancy. So 12 weeks equals 3 different months. And there are lots of things that happen over this time, and I just kind of want to go through those, all of the interesting stages of the growth of a baby. And a lot of these things are quite important. Well, obviously all this is important to an expectant mother, but a lot of these are really important benchmarks because they allow people to kind of keep track of how their baby is developing. There are certain stages where you can run scans and find out if everything looks normal and healthy. And a lot of expectant mothers really like knowing exactly what things are happening at what stages so they can imagine what's happening within the uterus, because they often don't feel anything until several weeks or even months along, and they don't, they have no sense of this growing thing inside them. So it's quite interesting to look and see exactly what's happening and how fast certain things develop and how slow other things develop, to just get a sense of kind of what is happening as that baby is developing. So first of all, one of the kind of interesting things about the whole way that we calculate pregnancy and the length of pregnancy is that the first trimester includes not just the blastocyst stage itself and the implantation, but also the 2 weeks before conception even occurs. And the 3rd week is then when fertilization occurs, and the 4th week is when the implantation takes place. So when the blastocyst is about the size of a poppy seed, which is, amazing to imagine that something could start that small and then become a full-grown baby. So all of those things happen before all the really interesting stuff occurs in terms of the baby's kind of growth into an actual, very obvious little human being. So when the 4th week rolls around and you've got implantation happening, the placenta can finally begin to develop. And until this is complete, the embryo is being nourished by nutrients from a tiny little yolk sac. So not unlike, for example, what you would find if you were to break open an egg and you see the yolk there. Humans have their own version of this as well. And as the placenta develops, it connects really deep within the wall of the womb, and this allows the baby to get quite a rich supply of blood from its mother, and also with nutrients and oxygen as well. And I talked quite a while ago on the show about kind of why we developed menstruation, why we developed certain types of placentas, and so I'm not going to go into that again now in case I've got some chronic listeners, but it is just important to note that this is one of the things that's quite unique about humans, that we have infants and we have babies that have a really strong connection internally to the mother while they are developing, so that they can really get a lot of the mother's energy sources, a lot of her oxygen, all this stuff that they're taking from the mother in order to really help their growth. And there's quite a bit of giving from the mother that is much more in humans than in some other animals. And this is one of the things that makes us kind of unique and makes our big brain size and high intelligence possible, most likely, because we're able to fuel this amazing growth of our young at a very early age. Now, the placenta itself won't be fully developed until week 12, so it's only just beginning to develop at this early stage. And between weeks 5 and 12, so when that whole placental growth is beginning to the point where it actually finishes, there are some really amazing things that are beginning to happen that will kind of distinguish the baby. It will start off looking kind of tadpole-like almost, and really by the end of that you start to see things that are quite clearly human. So around week 5 is when you might first have a test that can actually reveal a pregnancy, and it's also the first time when an expectant mother would miss her first period and so realize that maybe something is going on in there. So by the time you have kind of a sense that there is a pregnancy, well over a month has likely already passed. Now between weeks 5 and 6, you have the development of enough electrical brain activity that a scan could actually detect it. There's also development of blood vessels, which allows the growing heart to circulate the baby's own blood, so it's not just relying on kind of influence of the mother, it can do these things for itself as well. And a small string of these blood vessels will connect the baby with the mother and will develop into the umbilical cord. During this time, the embryo will also develop facial features, so things like eyes and nostrils. Arms and legs will also begin to grow, and they will develop quite rapidly. And the limbs are going to come from little swellings that are known as limb buds, while the ears will emerge from tiny little dimples on the side of the head. And the eyes, when you see them quite early on, they're not really obvious eyes, but you do see kind of thickenings on the face where you can see that all those cells are beginning to reproduce and that structure is beginning to be put into place. Because the brain is growing really fast at this stage, the baby's head is going to be quite disproportionate relative to the rest of the body. And you do see this for quite a long time in the early on scans. And you've probably seen scans. Actually, that's probably an interesting thing for me to post on the Wildside webpage, in case you haven't seen scans outside of maybe a movie where, of course, I think we all have seen them. But you often do see quite a tadpole-like kind of structure with a very big head and then kind of a body that's not really all that clearly defined early on. And so you will have this disproportionate kind of brain and head until several weeks and even months from now, at which point the body will start to kind of catch up. From week 8 onwards, the baby is officially called a fetus. And at this point it might actually begin to move, and this won't be felt by the mother until the 2nd trimester, but this process is called the quickening. So when you can kind of begin to get a sense that the baby is indeed alive and well in there and developing normally. Now the heart is not fully formed until the 10th week, and when it is finally done and complete and it only has to get larger, it is beating normally but at a much higher rate than is found in an adult human. So it'll be something like 2 to 3 times what the mother's heart rate would be. And by the end of the 12th week, the fetus is also fully formed, not just in the heart, but also in terms of its muscles, its organs, its limbs, and its bones. And all these things are kind of in the right place, they're oriented in the right way, so it looks quite human. And all the baby has to do at this point is basically grow larger and mature. So all the foundation work has been laid, and then it's just up to the baby to just kind of take up all the nutrients and reproduce until it's basically going through a growth spurt and coming up to full size. And the only other kind of developmental thing that's really obviously happening at this point to kind of turn the baby into its final form is that the cartilage skeleton will begin to develop into hard bone. Welcome back to the Wild Side. That was Slim Harpo with Baby Scratch My Back. And today we are talking about pregnancy. And before the break I was talking about the 1st trimester of pregnancy. And now I want to cover the 2nd trimester, and that is weeks 13 through 28. And during this time the baby will experience external development of genitalia, so expectant parents will finally be able to find out what their baby's gender is. And as I mentioned earlier, the head was quite a lot larger than the body for a while, but at this point the body is going to start to catch up, and together the two of these things from week 21 onward will allow the baby to finally weigh more than the placenta in which it has been developing. So this is pretty noticeable growth at this point. Now over this time the baby is also going to experience gradual improvement in its sensory abilities. And amazingly, even though we're only talking about, the 2nd third of the baby's growth, is already going to begin to perceive light filtering in from outside the womb. And this will happen even though the baby's eyes are still shut. It can also hear sounds of the digestive system of its mother, also of its mother's voice and heartbeat. And the baby's also going to begin to move much more, and it may in fact move in response to some of these external events because it's beginning to sense them. So it can feel the motion of its mother, it can hear loud noises if there's something kind of surprising and quite noticeable in the environment, and so it might react to those things. The muscles of its face can also move, and this allows it to begin to make facial expressions for the first time, though it appears that these can't really be controlled by the baby. It doesn't have quite the mental capacity to do that yet, but the muscles are all twitching in the right way and getting it ready to make these sorts of faces later on in life. It can also flex its limbs, so it's not going to be able to move around a whole lot because it's beginning to get to the phase where it's too big to really kind of stretch out and change position, but it certainly can flex its muscles and begin to kind of get those a bit stronger, almost in the way that baby birds will begin to flex their wings a bit before they start to fly. Babies in the womb can also kind of move around and get the muscles going. Amazingly, all this time, the hands have not been able to reach each other because the arms have been too short. But finally, by this stage, the hands can reach each other, and often the baby will form them into fists, or even have them hold each other so it might look like it's kind of almost praying. So they will reach across their own body and curl themselves up with their hands joined. And the lines will start to show on the fingers and feet, which means that the baby by this point will finally have its own unique set of prints that will distinguish it from all other humans. And this happens well before it leaves the womb. Now by 20 weeks, the baby will be covered in something called vernix, and this is Latin for varnish. And this thing is a waxy substance that's made up of lipids and cholesterol and something called ceramide. And people still aren't 100% sure what the function of vernix is, but it seems to function in a number of ways. So it may act as a waterproofing for the baby while it floats in the amniotic fluid, so it can kind of protect the skin. It may also help to conserve heat. It also provides some electrical isolation from all the other stuff that's going on in the mother's body, which might be helpful for development. And it can provide a physical barrier to the passage of bacteria. And again, all of these things may be equally useful, or there may be certain particular reasons why this evolved, and then these other things just happen to also be kind of handy side effects. Another thing that you'll start to see on the baby is something called lanugo, and this is Latin for the word wool. And this is a fine, soft, unpigmented, downy hair that is found all across the baby. And it's the first hair that's produced by the baby's hair follicles. And normally most babies will shed this actually several weeks before they're born, but it may also last through birth, and many babies will have it for several weeks after they're born, at which point it does finally kind of, it's shed. So the hair, most of the time, as I said, does go away before the babies are born, and it just falls off into the amniotic fluid. And the fluid throughout the pregnancy is going to be consumed by the baby, so it kind of sucks it in and spits it back out early on, but then later it will suck it in, it will actually swallow it, and then urinate it back into the amniotic fluid. And this all sounds, I know, kind of bizarre, and I only mention it because, well, I mention it because it's interesting, but also because one of the first things I remember ever hearing on the TV show QI that really caught my attention was this fact. They had kind of a laugh about it because it did sound so improbable and kind of alien, but it was something that is absolutely true, that babies do basically consume their own hair that they have shed within the womb. And they have this special kind of product that is within their intestinal tract when they are developing, and it will basically take the place of poo, because they haven't had any food in the womb, and so they don't really have poo, but it will replace that in their intestines so that the intestines can kind of become ready to digest later on, and the hair will often be a part of that. So when they do come out of the womb and they do finally pass that, you can sometimes find evidence of the hair that they've consumed. Now, isn't that a fantastic fact that you can share at the next party you go to? So anyway, I'll move on to something, I guess, a bit more palatable in case any of you are having a late lunch out there. The baby at this point still can't breathe, but it will begin to practice some breathing movements. And the lungs are sufficiently developed by 24 weeks that a baby that's prematurely born at this point could potentially survive, because it is able to actually breathe on its own. And now it may be quite difficult, and there may be quite an extensive amount of medical care that's required, but theoretically it could survive. Much before this, though, and it's not going to be able to get the oxygen that it needs, and things would be quite dire. Another thing that can happen by this point is that babies can hiccup and they can yawn. They might begin sucking their thumbs. They're also finally at this point able to open and close their eyes by the end of the second trimester, and they can even begin to dream. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure how it is that researchers know that they can dream at this point. I don't know if they've watched them kind of twitch as they sleep, or if they've put little tiny brain scanners on the babies through the mother's womb. I have no idea, but it is something evidently that people have actually researched and uncovered. Now finally, the last phase of pregnancy is the third trimester, and this will begin at week 29 and then go through whenever the baby is born. Now typically this is about week 40, but it can also be a bit before that, it can also be a bit after. And during this period of the pregnancy, the fetus is growing more rapidly than at any other phase of the pregnancy, and the gains may be up to about 28 grams per day. And I know that doesn't sound like a whole lot, but to just kind of put it into perspective, When I was doing my PhD research and I was banding eastern bluebirds, or ringing as you would call it here, an adult eastern bluebird, which is kind of like a small version of a blackbird, something kind of the size of something between maybe a chaffinch and a blackbird. These guys were about 30 grams. So we're talking, you know, the baby's putting on enough weight to equal the weight of kind of a smallish, medium-sized bird, which is really an impressive thing if you've got that kind of visual to imagine just growing all that much within a single day. Now, because of all this, obviously the mother's belly is going to begin to grow even more to accommodate all of that mass of the baby, but it's also going to start to change shape at this point. And partly this is because the fetus will begin to turn into a downward position, and this causes the belly to drop, as was what most people will refer to it as. And it will drop from this upright kind of vertical type position to a much lower position, and this normally happens by week 32. Now, except for the components of the skull, the baby's bones at this point are going to continue to harden and become increasingly you know, the kind of permanent, regular adult type of bones that we have as adult humans. And those in the skull are going to remain soft and separated so that the baby can squeeze through the birth canal while still having a protected brain. And amazingly, because of this fact that the plates aren't connected, they can actually kind of slide over each other a little bit and compress down. And this is why babies are often born with very funny shaped heads, and why C-section babies tend to have much more normal shaped heads than babies that are born naturally within those first few days. And after the first few days, the head generally does kind of go back to a more rounded, normal sort of shape. And this, I know, is quite a crazy thing, but it is a really amazing bit of evolution that allows this to happen. Now, in the last few weeks before birth, the baby's head should move down into the woman's pelvis, and this actually can make the baby bump seem a little bit smaller. And this phase is called being engaged, and basically the baby is now ready to come out with its head oriented down and then its limbs back behind it through the birth canal. And this is the safest way for a baby to be born, the easiest way for the mother. By 36 weeks, the baby has fully formed lungs, so not only are they, you know, capable of helping the baby survive if it were to be born prematurely, but by this stage it would be able to actually breathe on its own without help of any sort of respiratory device that the medical staff might need to apply. So 36 weeks is when the baby can take breaths completely on its own. It also at this point has a digestive system that's prepared to handle breast milk, so it's able to feed on its own as well, and so it's really prepared at this stage to be born. However, the full-term pregnancy isn't really considered to happen until the baby makes it to 37 weeks, and after this actually it may continue to incubate for several more weeks. So just because the baby is ready to be born at 36 doesn't mean that's actually when it's going to come out, and often that isn't when it comes out. So any birth before this 37 weeks is considered premature, and babies actually have successfully been born anywhere from the stage called extreme prematurity, which is before 28 weeks, to late preterm, which is the 34 to 36 weeks. And the later the birth, the better the chances of helping the baby get through and kind of develop and grow normally. But there are lots of babies that survive fairly early birth because of, again, the amazing medical advances that we have. And I actually have lots of friends who have gone through watching their children for the first several weeks grow up in an incubator attached to respiratory devices being fed through tube, and they turn out perfectly fine in the end. But it's really a testament to how incredible our medical system is, because there are all these things that are still kind of happening in these last few weeks, where you've got the lungs finishing up their growth, you've got the intestines finishing up their preparation to deal with food. And so it is kind of impressive that a baby born at that early stage can still make it in the end. Welcome back to the Wild Side. That was the Be Good Tanya's with I Wish My Baby Was Born. And as you might guess from that, today we are talking about pregnancy in humans. And just before the break I was talking about the third trimester and kind of the last few developments that a baby goes through before it's ready to be born. And I don't want to talk about the actual birthing process, at least not this week. Potentially I'll go through that next week. But I do want to talk about the newborn stage. And this is where things get I think, really interesting. I mean, it's amazing looking at the development of the baby and kind of what happens when. But things I think are particularly interesting in newborns because you really are beginning to see the brain get involved, and you can see the engagement of the baby with the external environment that is, of course, so different from the one it was used to within the womb. Now, as I mentioned earlier, most pregnancies last about 40 weeks, or about 280 days, from the first day of the mother's last period. And when the baby is born after all of this, it will have really wide shoulders and hips, arms and legs that seem quite long with respect to the rest of the body, and a slightly protruding abdomen. And all of this is a result of the growth process and kind of the bits of the baby that evolution has kind of shaped as being the ones that should be developed first in order to help it survive best once it gets, well, actually both within the womb and also once it exits and is out in the environment. So this is kind of a weird looking baby if you kind of compare it to what we look like as adults, but that's because these characteristics are what have helped babies survive the best over time. Now, the average length of a baby is typically 36 to 51 centimeters, and the average weight is about 3.4 kilograms. And this is in the West, so obviously it's going to be different elsewhere when you've got kind of different morphologies at play. Amazingly, the weight of the baby will decrease by anywhere from 3 to 7% in the first week, and that's because the baby is offloading a bunch of unneeded fluids. And after this, once it starts breastfeeding regularly, it will start to put on weight again and grow quite rapidly. Now, the head, again, as we discussed earlier, the head was always kind of disproportionately large, and then the body caught up, but the head is still going to be quite big, to the extent that it actually accounts for about 25% of the baby's entire body length. And this is quite a lot larger than what it is in adults. And the head will feature something called fontanelles, which are soft spots where there isn't yet bone. And the fusion of the skull plates will eventually happen so that the fontanelles are no longer there. It's quite actually a creepy thing if you see very young babies, where you can actually see the heartbeat pulsing through the fontanelles often, and it's quite unusual. I know that my husband used to talk about how when he was a child and saw his baby sister's head, he and his siblings found it absolutely fascinating to see the soft spot in the skull. So it is quite an unusual feature, but there is a protein that's eventually released that will help those plates join up. And amusingly enough, the protein is known as noggin because scientists like to be witty when they are naming these things. So when babies are first born, they're going to be subjected to something called the APGAR test. And the APGAR was a doctor, but also this is an acronym that stands for features that are looked at and judged and then added up. So each one is going to be on a range of 0 to 2, and there are 5 of them. So you're looking at a scale of 10 to tell you how healthy a baby is. And you can use the absolute values, but you can also do this APGAR test at multiple times and then compare them to see how the baby is improving. So you perform a test at 1 minute and at 5 minutes after birth, and you can repeat this again if necessary. And what you're looking for is appearance of the baby, pulse, grimace, activity, and respiration. And each one of those, if you look at the first letters, that's what spells APGAR. So basically, people are looking for babies that are pinkish, they have a pulse that's above 100, they cry or they pull away if they're stimulated. They can flex their arms and their legs. Whenever they're extended, they'll pull them back in. And also they can cry kind of lustily and loudly, and they will really be vocal. And babies, once they show all these and they're kind of in a nice healthy phase, they can be carried off, they can be given to the mother, they can be put in the nursery, and then they will begin to adjust to this whole new world that they're in. And they can feel a lot of new sensations that they wouldn't have felt so much before when they were in the womb. And they're able to feel all the things that we can feel as adults, but one of the ones that they tend to respond most positively to are tactile experiences. So things like stroking and cuddling and caressing, rocking and massages, these all seem to be one of the things that does stimulate babies the most, or at least in the happiest sort of way. They will exhibit an instinctive suckling behavior that allows them to feed basically immediately. And breastfeeding is another thing. It's not just good for food, it also is a very comforting thing to babies and can make them happy and calm down. And this is why a lot of mothers will continue breastfeeding for quite a long time to help their babies get to sleep, because it does kind of comfort them and calm them down. And another thing, of course, that can help do this is thumb sucking or use of a pacifier. Now, vision of newborns is quite poor, so the babies can only see about 18 inches in front of them, and this is not very much, but it does allow two really important things. And the first is eye contact with the mother, and also the second is vision of the breast during feeding. So they might not be able to see a whole lot, but they can see probably the two most important things in their lives. So of course this is going to be good enough. And little by little that eye will continue to develop and their nerves will continue to develop, so they are able to see things at increasing distances and kind of respond to them more and more. And early on, infants will show the most interest in objects that are shiny, things that have contrasting colors, and things that have really complex patterns. And so this is why a lot of the mobiles that are hung above kind of nursery cots and that are hung on the little strollers that you might take out in the street, that's why they tend to be really brightly colored. They often will have a little mirror kind of hanging on them somewhere. They tend to have kind of zebra patterns and things like that. And all of this isn't just to make it look kind of fun and cutesy and kid-like. It actually is developed to stimulate the baby's brain, because that's what the baby can see at that phase of its development. Amazingly though, lots of studies have consistently shown that the greatest preference is for human faces. So if you want to put anything out in front of the baby to get it interested and get it watching the world, that's great, and it will be stimulating and interesting. But actually the thing that it will engage most with is a human face. And this is of course an evolutionary thing, because it's going to be really important for babies to know the individuals around them and to very quickly begin to understand different facial expressions and the meaning of those expressions, and they can start to take in all that information quite young. And you probably have seen before on TV these videos where they will show babies responding to facial expressions by mimicking them themselves. And this is really an amazing thing that actually quite early on, babies probably don't even know what it is that they are doing when they're making these faces, but they are very good at keying in on the faces that they see in front of them and then replicating those in order to kind of begin to learn how to emote and how to interact with the humans around them. Now at this point they can also respond to lots of different flavors, but they seem to have a preference for sweetness. And in fact this preference is maintained through children for quite a long time. And this is one of the reasons why if there's a food that you really loved as a kid, and then you kind of give it up as you get older, and then you go back and taste it when you're an adult, you might think it tastes absolutely disgusting. And one of the big things that we had in the US, I'm actually not sure if you can find it here, is something called SpaghettiOs. And SpaghettiOs are a huge favorite of kids, and basically it's just little rings of pasta in a tomato sauce. But it's quite sweet, and so kids absolutely love it. And then if you go back and you taste it now, when you're my age, for example, it tastes absolutely revolting, because it's kind of like someone has accidentally dumped some sugar into the spaghetti sauce. And so it really is, it's amazing how different our preferences are when we're young and when we're old. And I've also been told that one of the reasons that young children don't seem to like things like broccoli is that they also have a very strong sense of bitterness. And so we're trying to feed them these things that are quite good for them, but actually their sense of taste is much different than ours, because it's still kind of developing and balancing out, and so that kind of flavor is very overwhelming to them. Now, according to some of the things I read, babies also can have a preference for the foods that were eaten by the mother during pregnancy and the flavors of those foods, and that's because evidently those flavors can influence what the amniotic fluid is like, and so the babies, as I said, do kind of swallow that, and so they'll get a taste of that early on, and that will kind of seem, comforting, and it'll seem like home. And apparently also breast milk can be influenced by the things that the mother is eating. So there will be certain flavors that the baby is going to be more comfortable with just because they are familiar from what the mother is eating. And this is also true for sounds as well. And the baby often will begin to show preference for sounds that it heard while it was in the womb. So for example, mom's favorite song, or a song that was played during the credits of mom's favorite TV show. Newborns also have been able to hear their mother's voice particularly well. Now it will sound different to them than it sounds to the people in the outside world, because they're hearing it internally and they're hearing it through liquid, but it will still be recognizable to them. And so they are going to be responding very well to their mom's voice. And of course, most women have voices that are higher pitched than men's voices. And so in general, infants do seem to respond more to higher pitched, higher frequency voices. And this is one of the reasons why people think that we've developed what is sometimes known as motherese, where whenever we see young children, we have kind of a high-pitched voice, and we say, "Oh, hello, how are you? You're so cute." We do the same things with pets, because we do seem to respond to pet animals and little animals in the same way that we respond to little people. And so we have this higher-pitched voice because it does seem to make babies respond to us much better. Amazingly, another thing that newborns will respond to in terms of noise is also the rhythm of their mother's breathing and also the rhythm of her heartbeat. And so again, that's because they've been exposed to that all that time in the womb, and so it does seem kind of comforting and natural and home-like to them. And this is one of the reasons why babies will often like to lie on the mother's chest in order to sleep, because that gets them kind of as close as they can get to that initial place where they were growing and developing when they were in the womb. And I think maybe on that happy, lovely thought, I will go ahead and end this week's show with the promise that I'm going to revisit this same topic next week, but think about it from a different perspective. So from the perspective of the mother and the sorts of changes that happen to her body as she undergoes pregnancy. Maybe I'll also think about, if I'm brave enough, childbirth a little bit. But I have to admit, I was reading a little bit about childbirth over the weekend, and I just got so uncomfortable thinking about having to go through that I had to just quit and go back to these other more gentle topics. But maybe for the sake of science, I'll dive right into that next week. But for now, I'm going to leave you with Emmylou Harris singing "My Baby Needs a Shepherd." And that's all for me this week, so I will talk to you next week.